Hi, Rudyard Griffiths here, chair and moderator of the Monk Debates. These are conversations that we're doing with each of our debaters tonight. So the Monk Debate on the Russia-Ukraine war. We're going to explore some of the key issues and ideas that are going to shape this hour-and-a-half contest. My next guest is John Mearsheimer. He is a celebrated academic and professor teaching political science at the University of Chicago. You've seen John Mearsheimer's byline in articles, essays, and books around the world. He's one of the most sought-after experts on America's role in the world. John Mearsheimer, thank you for coming to Toronto and being part of the Monk Debates.
I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, we're thrilled to have you. You've been a prominent public voice in this conversation about the war in Ukraine. Many people have rightly acknowledged that you were prescient about the risk of this war long before other people gave it the credence maybe that it was due. What did you see in the earlier part of the last decade that led you to believe that Russia and Ukraine were on a path to war?
Well, I believed from 2008 forward, when NATO said that Georgia and Ukraine would become part of NATO, that this was a prescription for really serious trouble. And the crisis over Ukraine broke out in February 2014. And at that point, I wrote an article in Foreign Affairs, and I also wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying it was the NATO decision to include Ukraine in that alliance that was the main cause of the problem. And I said that if NATO, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, doubled down and continued to push to incorporate Ukraine into NATO, that it would blow up in our face. And the reason is that for the Russians, and it's not just Vladimir Putin, it's virtually every member of the Russian elite, the idea of Ukraine in NATO is an existential threat. As Bill Burns, who's now head of the CIA and was the American ambassador in Moscow in 2008 said, this is not simply the brightest, this is simply not a bright line. It is the brightest of red lines for the Russians. And of course, what we're seeing today is proof that Burns was correct.
You will hear an argument tonight, no doubt, that Ukraine was effectively overruled for ever joining NATO, that Putin was provided with security guarantees informally by the Chancellor of Germany and others that they would use a veto to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, and that Russia had assurances. They understood that formal membership, a path to NATO membership, was not on the table. So explain to me this perceived disconnect between what you feel was a perception on the Russians' part of an existential threat, Ukraine as a member of NATO, versus possibly an alternate history or an alternate view there, that was never going to happen, and that this is just an excuse that Putin has used to wage a war of aggression.
Simply not true. The evidence is overwhelming that the argument that you're making is wrong. And in fact, on a number of important occasions and in important documents during the course of 2021, the United States reiterated that it was explicitly committed to bringing Ukraine into NATO. Moreover, we were making Ukraine, over the course of 2021, and even before that, a de facto member of NATO. We were arming the Ukrainians, we were training the Ukrainians, and we were actually running training exercises like Operation Seabreeze with Ukrainian military forces. So Ukraine was well on its way to becoming a member of NATO. And again, as I said initially, we made it explicitly clear in documents that are public that we were fully committed to bringing Ukraine into NATO. So the narrative that you describe, which is definitely the narrative in the public, simply is at odds with the facts.
Good. Well, we will explore that narrative in the debate tonight. Talk to us a little bit about your philosophy about international relations, because you're considered one of the world's most prominent realists when it comes to your view of how nation states and particularly great powers interact. If I were to ask you, what is the core insight of realism when it comes to this war? What would that be?
Well, my argument is that Russia, as a great power, is very concerned about its neighborhood. The same way the United States is concerned about its neighborhood. And here we're talking about the Western Hemisphere. As all Canadians know, the United States has the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine says that no other country in the Western Hemisphere, including Canada, is allowed to form a military alliance with a distant great power and then allow that distant great power to put military forces in the Western Hemisphere. This, of course, was the principal cause of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Well, the Russians are also a great power. And the idea that NATO can march up to Russia's border and incorporate Ukraine into it is simply unacceptable to the Russians. For the same reason, it's unacceptable for the United States, for the Soviet Union to put missiles in Cuba. In other words, great powers care greatly about the spheres of influence around them. And Ukraine fits very neatly in this category for the Russians. The other thing that you want to remember about great powers, and this includes the United States of America, is that great powers are ruthless. When great powers think that their security is being threatened, you do not want to underestimate how aggressive, how nasty they can be, how brutal they can be. So what you see the Russians doing in Ukraine is, in my opinion, not surprising at all. And in fact, in 2008, at the Bucharest summit, when NATO announced that it was going to bring Ukraine into the alliance, Putin made it unequivocally clear that he would destroy Ukraine before he let that happen. And what is now happening in Ukraine, tragically I might add, is that the Russians are effectively destroying Ukraine. But this should not be a surprise to any realist, because any realist understands that this is the way great powers behave. Whether that's good or bad is an issue that we can discuss at great length, but it is a basic fact of life in international politics.
So let me go there just briefly, because there's the world as the way it is and the world that we want it to be. There is within the West and within our kind of values about how we think the world should work, a view that there are rules and that those rules transcend the interests of great powers. Those rules include principles like the absolute sovereignty of nations and states, the immutable sovereignty, the extent to which there are liberal international values that are responsible, people would argue, for so much of the prosperity that we've enjoyed over the last half century or more. So tonight's debate is about acknowledging or not Russia's security interests. What would your response be to someone who would say, no, we shouldn't acknowledge their interests because this is bigger than Russia. This is about the kind of world we want. And if we acknowledge Russia's war of aggression, that world will slip away, and there are other great powers, China most notably, who will receive an object lesson in the perceived weakness of the West in terms of its own ability to assert its values, its vision of how the world should work.
Well, I think during the unipolar moment, which ran roughly from 1990, the end of the Cold War, until 2017 when President Trump moved into the White House. During that unipolar moment, the United States had an opportunity, because it was the sole great power on the planet, to shape the world in the way that you just described. We pursued a policy that I would call liberal hegemony. The idea was to create a liberal world order that transcended the past, that moved beyond great power politics, that moved beyond realism. That endeavor failed, and the unipolar moment is over with. And we now live in a world where there are three great powers. We've gone from unipolarity to multipolarity. And this unipolar world is going to be a brutal world. The fact of the matter is, despite all the focus these days on US-Russian relations, the real fight that's coming is in terms of US-China relations. Russia is not a peer competitor to the United States. China is a peer competitor. We have our gun sights on China. We're going to go to great lengths to contain China, and indeed we're going to go to great lengths to roll back its power, the same way we tried to contain and then roll back the Soviet Union. The United States is going to pursue ruthless policies towards China, just as it did towards the Soviet Union. So what we have going on here is the United States of America that is acting in a very hard-nosed way towards Russia and acting in a very hard-nosed way towards China. This tells you that the world of the future, this multipolar world, is going to be very much a balance of power or a realist world, and there's going to be very little room for liberal idealism.
Final question that I'm asking all of our debaters before the debate tonight. Put your mind forward 5 years. What does the situation of Ukraine, Russia, and NATO look like half a decade from now? Who's where and who's doing what?
It's very hard to say. And the reason I say that is I don't know how the Ukraine war ends anytime soon. It's important to understand that for Russia, they have to win in Ukraine. Because if they lose, Ukraine becomes a part of NATO, and that's an existential threat. That's an absolute no-no. So the Russians are in this one for the long term. Furthermore, the United States has made it clear that its goals in Ukraine include decisively defeating the Russians in Ukraine, strangling the Russian economy, bringing the Russians to their knees, and in effect, if you listen to General Austin, the Secretary of Defense, knocking the Russians out of the ranks of the great powers. This is a way of saying that we're in this one for the long term. We're fully committed to bringing the Russians to their knees. And the Russians are fully committed to winning in Ukraine and preventing Ukraine from becoming a part of NATO. Both sides can't win, and it's hard to see where the compromise is. And furthermore, we're talking about the possible use of nuclear weapons. The Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, testified on Tuesday that there are two circumstances under which she believes there's a good chance the Russians will use nuclear weapons. The first is if NATO enters the fray, or if the Americans enter the fray, or if the Russians think that they are losing in Ukraine. Well, you want to remember that our goal is to make sure that the Russians lose in Ukraine, which Avril Haines is telling us, I think quite correctly, is the one scenario where they are likely to use nuclear weapons. So the great paradox here, and it's indeed a perverse paradox, is that the more successful we are in the West in achieving our present goals, the more likely it is that the Russians will use nuclear weapons. So we are in a very dangerous situation. And again, as I said to you, I don't see where the off-ramp here is for either side. So I see this one going on and on for the foreseeable future. And I see the possibility of Ukraine being completely destroyed as very great, and I see the possibility of nuclear war as real. So this is, I think, a very worrisome situation. And this is why Steve and I are going to make the point tonight in the debate that what we really want to do here is go to great lengths to shut this down before it spins completely out of control.
Wise words, Professor Mearsheimer. Thank you so much for coming to Toronto and being part of this debate.
It's my pleasure.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.